Hi, I'm Peter J. Ray. Welcome to Adventures in History. Today's topic is Abraham Lincoln, Part 9, Firing on Fort Sumter, South Carolina. The U.S. Civil War starts. We stopped last time in 1861. Abraham Lincoln had been elected the 16th U.S. President in November of 1860. After that, a number of states in the South seceded from the Union. And in March of 1861, President Lincoln was inaugurated as president, and he appealed to the South. He would not compromise and allow the expansion of slavery into the Northwest, and he would not allow the southern states to leave the Union, and he appealed to them to think about what they were doing and to stay in the country and to not do what they were doing. Now, one time, Charles Sumner, one of the famous senators, visited President Lincoln in the White House. He saw Abraham Lincoln polishing his boots and said, quote, "Why, Mr. Lincoln, do you black your own boots?" And President Lincoln responded, "Whose boots did you think I blackened?" So there were a lot of humor, tragedy and humor associated with Abraham Lincoln. Another story, a New Jersey congressman met with Abraham Lincoln in the White House, and he brought two constituents with him. And he said, quote, "Mr. President, this Mr. X," he gave the name, "and Mr. Y, they are among the weightiest men in southern New Jersey." And after they left, Lincoln said, quote, "I wonder that the end of the state didn't tip up when they got off it." He was joking about them that they were the weightiest men. Secretary of State for Lincoln was William Seward, who was very popular in the South. Frederick Roberts of North Carolina said that Seward was looked upon as, quote, "the Hector or Atlas of not only of President Lincoln's cabinet, but the giant intellect of the whole North." Yeah, and that respect for William Seward continued into actually the next president. On March 4th, President Lincoln received a letter from Robert Anderson, the commander of the Union garrison at Fort Sumter, South Carolina, that they had supplies for 6 weeks. Without new supplies, they would be forced to surrender. Remember, South Carolina led the secession movement, the first state to secede, and Fort Sumter was in Charleston Harbor, and it remained under federal control. And Lincoln did not give it up, and it had not been surrendered yet. So this was the big issue. Now, President Lincoln's cabinet, he had these various secretaries of different departments. William Seward was Secretary of State, Salmon Chase of the Treasury, Simon Cameron, Secretary of War, Gideon Welles of the Navy, Caleb Smith, the Interior, Edward Bates was the Attorney General, Montgomery Blair was the Postmaster General. These were all very able men, and Abraham Lincoln had the ability to bring divergent voices together. So he did very well. They all had different ideas, of course, on the controversial times they faced. There was a painting of Andrew Jackson in Abraham Lincoln's office as president. It was said that President Lincoln's desk looked like it came from, quote, "some old furniture auction." Now, throughout his presidency, there were many visitors to see the president in the White House, and Senator Henry Wilson said to President Lincoln, quote, "You will wear yourself out." Lincoln responded, quote, "The people don't want much, they get but little, and I must see them." So he took the time to meet with people. Anyone who wanted to see him, he would take some time to hear what they had to say. Abraham Lincoln was a quick learner when he became president. He was not prepared to deal with the crisis of Fort Sumter immediately as his presidency started. And Fort Sumter was the main show. And then there was the big debate what to do. William Seward was against resupplying it. Winfield Scott, the head of the military, he argued that Fort Sumter should be evacuated. Winfield Scott was the top military man. He was 75 years old, General-in-Chief of the Army. He was in poor health. He suffered from dropsy and vertigo. He could not mount a horse, which was important during that era, and he could not climb stairs without help. The clock was running on Fort Sumter. A decision had to be made. General Scott told President Lincoln that Fort Sumter could not be resupplied. March 29th, President Lincoln decided that he would resupply Fort Sumter, either that or surrender it. He didn't want to surrender it. So there were weeks of nonstop debate and indecision. This was taking a toll on Abraham Lincoln, and he said, quote, "If to be the head of hell is as hard as what I have to undergo here, I could find it in my heart to pity Satan himself." President Lincoln became a regular in his attendance at the New York Avenue Presbyterian Church in Washington City as president. April 1st, 1861, President Lincoln asked Winfield Scott for daily reports from the War Department. He wanted to be up to date on what was going on, and he wanted to be more directly involved in military operations. April 6th, President Lincoln notified Andrew Pickens, the governor of South Carolina, that an attempt would be made to resupply Fort Sumter. Now, the leaders in the Confederacy, they believed that this action was a direct threat to them. On April 12th, General Pierre G.T. Beauregard ordered the Confederate battery to open fire on Fort Sumter. In other words, they started firing artillery on Fort Sumter. The next day, April 13th, after 33 hours, 4,000 shots and shells landed on Fort Sumter, and the decision was made by the authorities on Fort Sumter to surrender. So this is considered the first shots fired in the Civil War fired by the Confederates, the bombardment of Fort Sumter, South Carolina. At the White House, there was foreboding and expectation. The stalemate was over, and the war had started. President Lincoln intended to ask for 75 volunteers to join the U.S. Army. He needed Congress to prosecute and pay for a war. On April 15th, President Lincoln called for a special session of Congress to convene on July 4th to discuss this situation. The coming storm had arrived in the waters off of South Carolina. April 15th, there was panic in Washington City. The streets were barricaded. The buildings were blocked. There were police and soldiers on the streets. President Lincoln paced the second floor of his office at the White House. After Fort Sumter, 3 of Mary's brothers joined the Confederate Army. President Lincoln's wife, Mary, her brothers George, Sam, and David. And the news came that Mary's favorite sister, Elodie, who was living in Selma, Alabama, became engaged to a Confederate captain. One of the ironies of the Civil War is that both Abraham Lincoln, President of the U.S., and Jefferson Davis, President of the Confederacy, both had roots in Kentucky. Now, in Kentucky, 40% of white Kentuckians fought for the Confederacy. 60% fought for the Union. And this was a ratio closer to half than any other state, so that which meant that Kentucky was the most divided state. And it was exemplified by Abraham Lincoln and Jefferson Davis. When the war started, well, a lot of people, they think, oh, war, it's great. And there was euphoria in the North. War fever in North and South. They didn't know the nightmare that was coming. The North had a population of 20 million people. The South, 9 million, less than half. The North had 3 times the number of railroads. William Seward, the Secretary of State, believed that the war would be won and over in 3 months. In Chicago, the Chicago Tribune reported or expressed the opinion that the Union would win the war in 2 to 3 months. And they printed, quote, "Illinois can whip the South by herself." The New York Times predicted a Union victory in 30 days. Now, Dorothea Dix was a 59-year-old reformer, a woman. She was dedicated to the welfare of prisoners who'd been convicted of crimes and were in prison. She was dedicated to poor people, the mentally ill, and during the Civil War, she created an Army Corps of female nurses. to tend to the wounded soldiers from the North and the Confederate soldiers who fell into Union control. Her model was Florence Nightingale, who's made a tremendous nursing efforts in the Crimean War. Dorothea Dix was an advocate for better treatment for the mentally ill, more humane treatment, healthy diet and exercise, productive work for the mentally ill. She was also reported that she helped foil a plot to kill President Lincoln in 1861. When the Civil War started, she volunteered as a nurse, created an army of nurses. So Dorothea Dix became a very important person in the Civil War. She was soft-spoken, physically fragile. The Secretary of War, Cameron, accepted Dix's services who were offered, and she aided in the organization of military hospitals and the reception of donated supplies. Dorothea Dix requested industrial-sized coffee pots for the hospital kitchens. She was the superintendent of the women nurses in the Union Army, and Dorothea Dix became the first the first woman to hold a federal executive position. The Union Army's Medical Bureau was not prepared to meet the needs of this new 75,000-man army that President Lincoln was creating. There were no hospitals and no barracks in Washington City, and initially the soldiers slept on the floor of the Senate chamber. April 17th, Virginia seceded from the Union, and this meant, this right on the border of Washington City. At the White House window, they could see from the White House a Confederate flag flying in Alexandria, Virginia, across the Potomac River. President Lincoln could see that flag using a telescope. The flag's flying in Alexandria. April 19th, in Baltimore, there were riots. Maryland had a very strong Confederate sympathy, although it never actually joined the Confederacy. But there was strong Confederate support in Virginia, which meant Washington City was really surrounded by Confederate support. So there were these Confederate sympathizers in Baltimore who tried to stop New England troops from passing through on their way to Washington City. A lot going on. April 20th, federal authorities at the immense Norfolk Naval Shipyard in Portsmouth, Virginia, were busy burning buildings and scuttling the 10 ships in the anticipation of a takeover by Confederate troops. April 21st, rioters seized the telegraph office in Baltimore and cut off communication between the White House and the North. President Lincoln wondered who would defend Washington City. It was surrounded by Confederate forces. The National Army was, as I mentioned, under the command of Winfield Scott, this old man. There was only a 16,000-man army at the start. The majority of the troops were in 79 outposts on the western frontier. After the war started, 1/3 of all officers in the U.S. military left their commissions and joined the Confederacy. It was understood that Winfield Scott was too old. President Lincoln asked for a recommendation for someone who could command the Union Army, and Scott recommended Robert E. Lee. Now Lee did not accept that position. He ended up accepting a position as the Major General in command of all Virginia forces for the Confederacy. President Lincoln had a proclamation calling for 75,000 troops from the state militias who would serve services of 3 months of service. There was overwhelming support in the North for the war when the war started. Now, after the Fort Sumter, Virginia, Tennessee, North Carolina, and Arkansas all seceded. Now, this was a real heartbreaking time for Robert E. Lee. He was a patriot. He loved his country, but he just could not make war on Virginia, his home state. And he was sick. Of course, civil wars are always very, very tragic. Robert E. Lee's wife, Martha, was the daughter of the adopted son of George Washington. So you can see he had strong, and actually his his grandfather, had given the eulogy for President Washington after he died. First in war, first in peace, and first in the hearts of his countrymen. So, and he had had this really noble national service, and he loved his country, but he decided he could not make war on Virginia. Ohio Governor William Dennison said, quote, "We will furnish the largest number of troops you will receive." Now, the border states, these were the states which were slave states, but did not really never joined the Union, although had a lot of, never joined the Confederacy, although had a lot of Confederate support. These were Delaware, Kentucky, Missouri, and Maryland. The most important were Kentucky and Maryland. Of course, if Maryland had gone to the Confederacy, then Washington would be completely surrounded by the Confederacy. An intolerable situation. As it was, Virginia was right on the border. The Kentucky governor, Beriah Magoffin, said, quote, "Kentucky will furnish no troops for the wicked purpose of subduing her sister southern states." So that's a strong statement that they would not support the Union. Missouri Governor Claiborne Fox Jackson said, quote, "No, not one man will the state of Missouri furnish to carry on any such unholy crusade." Well, actually, Missouri was also very divided, but there were guys from Missouri who did support the Union. In Maryland, in the Baltimore mayor and secessionist members of the Maryland state legislature actively were helping the rebellion, not far away in Baltimore. And President Lincoln and his Secretary of State, William Seward, had them all arrested. Stephen B. Oates said, quote, "Through a mixture of gentle diplomacy and strong arm arrests, Abraham Lincoln redeemed troublesome Maryland." So he was able to, that was pretty tough, but he was able to keep Maryland out of the Confederacy through a mixture of kindness and being tough and being patient. Massachusetts Governor John Andrew was a radical Northern leader, early an abolitionist, started to assemble regiments for a war in January. Now, the challenge in getting these regiments south was to pass through the narrow neck of Maryland that had the only railroad links to Washington City from the north. Word that troops from the abolitionist stronghold Massachusetts were arriving in Baltimore. An angry crowd jeered the soldiers and threw rocks and bricks at them, and this became a real a bad situation. There was panic. The soldiers fired on the crowd. 12 civilians and 4 soldiers were killed. And so this was actually the first bloodshed in the Civil War, this fighting in Baltimore. The riot galvanized the Union and Confederate commitments. In other words, both sides became more determined to go to war. Nobody had actually died for the firing from Fort Sumter. April 22nd, a Baltimore committee of 50 men called on President Lincoln at the White House and asked for him to recognize the independence of the southern states. And Lincoln couldn't believe this, and he said, quote, they asked for no more troops to go through Baltimore. And President Lincoln was exasperated, and he was a very patient man, but he was out of patience in this situation, and said, quote, "Your citizens attack troops sent to the defense of the government, and yet you would have me break my oath and surrender the government without a blow. There is no George Washington in that, no Andrew Jackson in that, no manhood or honor in that." So he rejected that request. April 21st, President Lincoln summoned Maryland Governor Thomas H. Hicks and Baltimore Mayor George W. Brown to come to the White House to talk, and this issue of bringing Union troops across Maryland. President Lincoln said, quote, "I have no desire to invade the South, but I must have troops to defend this capital. Geographically, it lies surrounded by the soil of Maryland, and mathematically the necessity exists that they shall come over her territory. Our men are not moles and can't dig under the earth. They are not birds and can't fly through the air. There is no way but to march across, and this they must do. So he was saying, listen, we've got those guys we need troops. They're coming from the north. They have to pass through Baltimore, and I need your cooperation in that, even though you guys were Confederate sympathizers. Ronald C. White, Jr. wrote, quote, "This abrasive challenge by Maryland authorities stiffened Lincoln's resolve to defend the capital and the Union. On April 24th, troops from the 6th Massachusetts Volunteers arrived in Washington City." So this was really wonderful. President Lincoln was relieved because he thought, well, okay, now we can. Before they thought, how can we defend this capital if the Confederates attack from Virginia? And he wondered about these. Kept waiting. When will more troops come from the north? And President Lincoln said, quote, "I began to believe that there is no north. The 7th Regiment is a myth. Rhode Island is another. You are the only real thing." However, 2 days later, the 7th Regiment from New York arrived, and there was, again, enthusiasm and relief. April 22nd was the great exodus from Washington City, as there was the exposure, resignation, and departure of federal people who decided they were going to support the Confederacy. Hundreds of government clerks and Army and Navy officers, high officials, and justices of the Supreme Court fled Washington City and made their stand for the Confederacy. Ronald C. White, Jr. wrote, quote, "Abraham Lincoln had long since learned to discount condemnation from opposition Democratic newspapers, but it became more difficult to ignore criticism from his friends. During this time, there were critical editorials in the New York Times, and so this was tough. You're fighting an enemy and you're being criticized on your side. Of course, that's just how it is. The challenge was that other challenge, Southern sympathizers in Maryland had cut the telegraph wires, burnt bridges to disrupt communication between the North and Washington City. Very tough situation. April 27th, President Lincoln ordered Winfield Scott to suspend habeas corpus if there was an insurrection in the area from Philadelphia to Baltimore to Washington. Now, the right of habeas corpus protects citizens from illegal detention and requires a prisoner to be brought to court to decide the legality of his arrest. So this is part of human rights, the rights that the government will not be abusive and just arbitrarily arrest people. So it's to protect people's rights. However, in the Constitution, there was the language is that this can be habeas corpus can be lifted in cases of rebellion and invasion and to protect public safety. And obviously, if you have, especially newspapers in the North, being critical of Lincoln's policies or of the war effort, could be a problem. Or people voicing their opinions, supporting the Confederacy from the North. So this was what was going on. Now the issue of habeas corpus, the Supreme Court and Roger Taney ruled against Lincoln, so he had challenges, all kinds of challenges, including the Supreme Court. Regarding his decision to suspend habeas corpus, which is, you could say, is not a violation of human rights or a reduction in human rights, President Lincoln said, quote, "I would consider my official oath broken if I should allow the government to be overthrown when I might think the disregarding of a single law would tend to preserve it." So in other words, everything had to be done to win the war. And habeas, if people are fomenting rebellion in the North, criticism of the war effort, then that was a threat to morale and the war effort itself. And so that's why he felt that he needed to be able to shut down newspapers or arrest people who were causing trouble. In May, President Lincoln said to John Hay, one of his assistants, quote, "I consider the central idea pervading this struggle is the necessity that is upon us. of proving that popular government is not an absurdity. We must settle this question now, whether in a free government the minority have the right to break up the government whenever they choose. If we fail, it will go far to prove the incapability of the people to govern themselves. So in other words, can what we call democracy or representative government, can the people rule themselves or not? Those were the stakes. Now, an interesting thing, Salmon Chase, one of the cabinet members, his daughter Kate Chase was a very beautiful young lady. She met William Sprague, the governor of Rhode Island. Eventually they got married. And William Sprague was in Cleveland, Ohio the year before, in September, for the dedication of a statue for Rhode Island native Oliver Perry, the hero of the Battle of Lake Erie in the War of 1812. And that statue is still here in Cleveland. So that's very interesting. So, Southern Democrats left Washington City. So, all the guys except for, the only senator to stay was Andrew Johnson. So, you had this big exodus in Congress from Democrats. This meant that Republicans had a substantial majority in the Congress, which actually, in a way, you would think would have made it easier to, at least there wasn't as much partisanship, Democrats fighting Republicans. One issue during the war came up when Union General Benjamin Butler refused to return to escaped slaves. As chaos began, slaves started running away, and the slave owners said, "We want them back," and he said no. This became an ongoing issue. And the point that he made was that the slaves were being used to support Confederate troops. They were involved in the Confederate war effort. So he said, they are contraband of war. May 3rd, President Lincoln made a proclamation for a call for an additional 42,000 volunteer soldiers and 18,000 sailors. Lincoln's family friend Elmer Ellsworth was in the 60th Regiment for Illinois, the state militia, the Zouave unit. They wore these bright red, blue, and gold uniforms with red caps. Ellsworth organized the New York Zouaves, and they paraded on a regiment down Pennsylvania Avenue. When Virginia seceded on May 23, 1861, Ellsworth and his regiment marched on Alexandria, Virginia, to cut telegraph communications to the south. Ellsworth, in this very tragic situation, there was an issue over a Confederate flag that he went to take down. He was shot and killed, and he was the first commissioned officer to die in the Civil War. President Lincoln was stunned and heartbroken over the death of Elmer Ellsworth. There was a funeral in the White House. He knew this young man personally, May 26. In the North, Ellsworth came to symbolize the courageous young men from the North willing to go to war for their country. President Lincoln wrote a letter to Ellsworth's parents, and this was the first of hundreds that he would write during the war, whose parents had lost a son. Now, an interesting thing is the White House reportedly was called the Executive Mansion during this time, and supposedly not until Theodore Roosevelt. The White House was it called the White House? Not sure if that's true or not, but this is a lot of the confusion of history. The White House was in very shabby shape, and Mary, the First Lady, was determined to fix it up. Mary was Southern by birth. She was determined to restore the White House, and her efforts were similar to those of Dolly Madison. Well, that concludes today's presentation. We'll continue next time with Part 9 Part 10 as the Civil War, early days of the Civil War. I hope you find a good history book to read. There are so many wonderful history books out there. You might consider checking out our website, Adventures in History, with Peter J. Ray at peterjray.com. So far, we've made 723 history videos in 7 areas: world history, American history, book reviews, poetic tours, Cleveland baseball, family history, and autobiography. There's a donate feature. You might consider making a donation so we can to support our work here. If you live in Metro Manila, Philippines, and are looking for a high school, you might consider Restless Educational Center. Restless is located on Allenby Street. in San Juan, Metro Manila, Philippines, not far from the corner of P. Guevara and Wilson Street. At Restless, we specialize in helping young people who have had difficulty in the larger traditional high schools. Restless is more than a school. We are a warm, supportive community, and we strive to be creative and innovative so the students enjoy learning and enjoy going to school. And the website is restless.education, RESALEST. Thanks so much for watching. I really appreciate it. God bless you. Take care, and I'll see you next time.